Well, my name is Donald Seawall, spelled Seawell but pronounced Sewell. I was born in a little town in North Carolina called Jonesboro, which is now Sanford, and grew up there, educated primarily at University of North Carolina. I have my AB and my JD, law degree, and for some reason they saw fit to give me an honorary Doctor of Literature later on. But very quickly after being admitted to the bar, I did go to Washington to be with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I became Associate General Counsel and even Acting General Counsel right soon after the war broke out. In December 7, I'd left my quarters in Washington, where I was with the SEC, and had gone to my apartment in New York. My wife was an actress, and we had to keep an apartment at both places. And I was in the New York apartment watching the Washington Redskin football game, when suddenly it was interrupted with the announcement that the Pearl Harbor had been bombed. But something very strange happened. Very soon after that, there came an announcement that the Japanese were bombing New York. So we went up to the roof of our apartment house to watch the bombing. But of course it didn't happen. It was a very false rumor. But I got back to Washington as soon as I could. And I was there by that evening, but the next day, half of Washington seemed to be in uniform. All of the people in reserve suddenly, bang, put on their uniforms. I knew that the time had come to get away from the SEC, although up until then it had been Roosevelt's white-haired agency. So I went first to the War Department on loan, and then to the Department of Justice. They had created at the Department of Justice a special War Policy Division, and I was brought in to head the section which coordinated the intelligence work of our CIC, OSS, ONI, Naval Intelligence, and the British MI5, MI6, and MI11. And they met several times a week in my office, and we got to work together. The FBI, very quickly, we had got arrangement that they would not participate in the war effort, but would serve only in domestic intelligence. But to some degree, I had to work with them too, let them know what was going on so we wouldn't cross swords. The chief of counterintelligence was a chap by the name of Hugh Douglas Wise, Jr., who had worked with me at the SEC. And one day after the meeting, he stayed behind. Incidentally, he was also my best friend and my best man at my wedding. But he stayed behind to say, look, we're setting up Supreme Headquarters, the Allied Expeditionary Force in London. Do you want to go? I said, of course I do. So he said, then raise your hand and repeat after me. And I repeated the oath. He said, now, you can salute me, I don't have to salute you. But he suggested that since it'd be a little while before it was set up, why didn't I volunteer in the Army and go into basic training and find out what it was all about? So I did. And it wasn't until the first night when I'd been spent all day washing dishes and hams about as big as a ham, that I realized that he'd never been in KP in his life. But anyway, I got even. By the time I got there, plans were pretty much in place. The British had been preparing for it a long time. You may recall that Churchill came on radio once and said, the battle for Britain is over. We have won it. The battle for Europe is about to begin. That was before we got into the picture. So they had started planning. I'm told that after he'd made that statement and it was off the air, he said, "Where in the hell we're going to get the weapons, I don't know." It had been typical Winston. I was never present at one of the Roosevelt and Churchill meetings, but I do know, and I think everyone does, that when the war broke out, Roosevelt realized that we were going to get in it and had to get in it, but there's so many people in Congress who were dead set against our having anything to do with it and would fight for isolation, that Roosevelt had to set up at leased land, which was never really leased land. We were furnishing them weapons. Supposedly they were to pay for them. And he and Churchill, as you know, met from time to time, first on the battleship and then in Washington. And they worked, I think, very well together. There were differences, but you're going to have differences of opinion among leaders and on details of anything, but on the broadest of the principles, they worked together. And I think that they were fond of each other. I had debated against Churchill in 1936 at the Oxford Union, so I already knew Churchill and his family.
What kind of a person was he?
He was a great man who was right for the role that he played in the war. He was highly opinionated. He and Eisenhower had a lot of, I wouldn't say fights, but disagreements on, for instance, when we decided we should bring the forces in from the south of France to join after D-Day. He didn't want them to come in there at all. He had other plans for them. But Ike insisted to go forward with it. And actually, Churchill himself went to the Mediterranean and was on the ship watching the invasion. He wanted to do the same. He wanted to do the same thing, of course, when we invaded France, and Ike had to overrule him. But I liked him very much. I liked his still very close to his one surviving daughter. When I did reach London, SHAEF had not been formed. It was Kozak, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Allied Commander, and the commanding general of it was General Freddie Morgan, a Britisher, and they were planning for D-Day. And my job was in the counterintelligence end to help with the scheme to convince the Germans that we were invading through the Pas de Calais and not through Normandy. And that was my job throughout the war. And of course, by the time I got there, the British had been working on it a very long time. We thought that Marshall was going to be the Supreme Allied Commander, and he would have been, except Roosevelt decided he needed him more in Washington. And Eisenhower, we didn't even know how to spell it at that first time, was made Supreme Allied Commander. And we were fortunate. It was a difficult job, and I think he did a marvelous job. When he became Supreme Allied Commander, in the Washington Telephone Directory, he was still listed as a major. That's how fast he went up. And he, along the way, he passed, of course, a lot of people who worked under him later. Well, of course, there was friction with Patton from time to time, but that was certainly justified. The Patton said before, just couldn't keep his mouth shut, and it was a security risk all of the time. But he was certainly a great tactical general, as he proved on so many occasions. When Ike arrived in London, Kazak was in a little building in central London. It immediately became Supreme Headquarters because we had our Supreme Allied Commander. And so we moved out to Bishop Park, which is outside of London. And that became SHAEF Headquarters. Ike looked at the plans which had been made by Kazak, and he contributed greatly to them. He decided that they were not strong enough and we needed more troops and a lot of other things. But basically they were the same. The plan had been to invade through Normandy, but that the Germans think we're going into the Pas de Calais. Ike liked the idea. And we had not set D-Day, and didn't do it until actually sometime, I think, May 15, when we met in St. Paul's School, which had been the headquarters of Montgomery, and picked June 5th as the date for the invasion. At that time, there were only 23 of us on what was called the bigot list. The bigot list was those who knew all about the invasion, the date, the time, who was in it, the cover plan, and everything else. And that number did stay very small until long after the plans were adopted. Eisenhower had lived just outside London, between London and SHAEF. There's one good thing about being at Supreme Headquarters. The people who were in one division thought that the war is going on here. At least we got to know what was going on everywhere. Ike himself wanted to be more involved in the actual combat. Who was going to be in charge of that was a fight between Montgomery on the British side and Bradley on the American side, before, after, and during the invasion. Ike was often frustrated by his inability to be in tactical charge. At one time he'd announced it to both Montgomery and Bradley that he was taking over on a tactical basis. But he soon found you couldn't be both Supreme Commander and be narrowly focused, so that his main job was to carry through on the big command and to try to keep peace within the two allied but warring forces. He was constantly torn, but he finally realized when he did say, okay, to Montgomery and to Bradley, I am now the ground commander, that things are going on too broad a basis. He had to get back to Supreme Headquarters where he could find out what was going on everywhere and issue orders that he couldn't have if he were there as a tactical general. But he did go to Montgomery's headquarters, Patton's headquarters, all of the forward that he could from time to time. And the troops were always happy to see that he was there. He would set up quarters near the front, but he couldn't stay there because he had to be back at Supreme Headquarters. We did have advanced headquarters near Portsmouth. He lived at Southwark House, supposedly, but he never did. He wanted to stay closer to the action, so he'd stay in a trailer. Ike himself wanted to work all of the time, and he would stay up incredible hours, but he never stopped smoking. And he would go through maybe a carton a day at a time, and just light one from another. And physically, he had a lot of problems, but he never let them get him down. And at West Point, he'd, for instance, wrenched a knee badly, and he did the other in an accident while we were planning the war, but he would still wouldn't let him get him down. He wanted to get as close to the front as he could. He was not afraid. Sometimes we were awfully worried that he pushed himself too close to the front, and he would take flights in unsafe aircraft. Our army that was going into Utah Beach, that was practicing on the shores of Devonshire. Ike was watching. And the German U-boats and other craft saw them and came in and really slaughtered them because they didn't have all of the artillery backing them up. They were just practicing the landing. They lost 20 times as many people in that practice than they lost when they went into Utah Beach. But we'd let word leak that they were practicing to go into the Pas-de-Calais area. We simply turned things around that way. Well, I think one thing that should be known is that Ike, of course, shut it up. Didn't let anybody talk about it until we leaked the false information out. But he was accused by a lot of people of trying to cover up. He didn't. After the actual invasion, he did send out a notice of what had actually happened, and of course sent messages to the kin of those who had lost their lives there. I was there when the decision was made to go in on June 15. We made that in London at St. Paul's School because they had to have some security there. And I think you know what happened on June 5. We had such a terrible storm we couldn't go. And I had to watch Ike pace back and forth outside his trailer lighting one cigarette after the other, but he made the decision to go on June 6, which was fortunate because the Germans were sure that we wouldn't be fool enough to try it. And their commanding General Rommel was back home in Germany. He had to make up his mind to go in on the 6th when the weather was still bad, and so many of his generals were advising him not to. Montgomery was one that said, go, let's go. But so many of his generals had thought that no, this weather was too bad. And we had created an artificial harbor there at Normandy. We had secretly made great concrete blocks that would sail across, and then we could sink, and then we sank many of old worn-out ships too. And that lasted for several days, long enough to get the troops in before another storm hit and wrecked them all. We were afraid that even one day's postponement would let them know that we were coming in, because we were all concentrated primarily at Portsmouth and at other areas there. And the Germans, well, the weather's too bad for the observation planes to come over, but they ultimately would have seen. And of course, just keeping the troops on the ships and troops ready to go. But Ike, as much as he could, got out among the airborne troops and other troops to let them know that he was behind them. He went in as soon as he could after the war, after the troops had landed, and sooner than his staff wanted him to. The Germans were getting information at the highest levels. Fortunately, they were getting the false information at the highest levels. That was my job, and I don't take. I was just a part of those working on the cover plan. They had some knowledge, of course. We had a great deal more knowledge than they did, because we had broken their code and they didn't know it. And they were never able to break ours or to capture our instruments, which were not allowed beyond division headquarters in any event. So that we could feed them false information, but we were able to intercept their message, and had broken their code, which they did not know. Earlier in the game, of course, we had broken the Japanese code, and the Chicago Tribune let the Japanese know that, published an article, the Japanese found out about it and changed the code, so it took us some time to break it again. Today, things are so different because you can't conceal information the way that you used to. To the victor belongs the spoils. History is, they would rewrite history. That isn't true anymore. But when the Plantagenets were defeated in England, their successors completely rewrote history and made them Richard III an evil man, and Richard III in the short term did so many good things that only historians dug up hundreds of years later. But in this case, I think we got to the point where you can't conceal the truth. And we had our reporters on the front lines. Ernest Hemingway, Papa, used to walk over and peer in the foxholes and say, "How you doing?" Bombs, shells are going off all around. We had so many that, as you know, that were killed during the war that really weren't waiting behind the lines, but were out front. Things were truly covered. The plan was extremely effective. We had the 21st Army Group, which didn't exist, but it was on paper the largest army ever created. And we had dummy tanks, and we even had commanders who thought they were commanding an army that didn't exist. There were so many things. Primarily was the creation of the artificial army to let them intercept communications between the army. We even had a signal corps that I had to instruct who thought that they were going into Pas-de-Calais, and they had all of the orders, but we let a lot of that slip. We had the Germans completely convinced that we were going in there. And as they testified, the commanders in Nuremberg, they did not think until we actually occupied that territory that we were not coming in. It was a complete success, not only up to D-Day, but after D-Day. It was called Fortitude, the name of the plan, and we continued to let the Germans think that this was just a feint. And they kept so many forces on the other side of the River Seine because they were sure we were coming in there. We had little things like The Man That Never Was, where we took a person who had just died, and with the permission of his family, dressed him in uniform, had some secret orders in his pocket, even had tickets to the theater that he hadn't been to, but he'd supposedly been to the night before, and let his body wash up on the shores where the Germans could get it and think, aha, now we know. But a lot of things like that. The cover plan went on and on after D-Day and was still successful, far beyond our dreams. His real battle was to keep the generals working together. I think that his ability to keep peace among his own generals was really his greatest role. Actually, there were more than one war going on. We're not only fighting the Germans in Japan, but there was a constant war between the high command, between the British generals, the American generals, and often between the British generals and the British generals and the American generals and the other American generals. And poor Ike had to referee that, and he did a magnificent job. Ike, for instance, issued a command. It was all right for English and American officers to call each other sons of bitches, But if he heard an American say, "You English son of a bitch," or if I heard the English officer say, "You American son of a bitch," you were fired. But so he was he was a real peacekeeper. There was a certain amount of jealousy on Montgomery's part, and Montgomery actually wanted to take over Supreme Command, and it got to the point where Ike had even written a letter to Montgomery relieving him of his command. But Montgomery's top assistant happened to be at Schaefer at that time, and he learned of this. He asked Ike to please hold up on the letter until he talked to Montgomery. He went back, and Ike received a letter from Montgomery, which was signed, "Your obedient servant." And that ended that. But Montgomery had a plan to penetrate through North Germany, a narrow alley, like an arrow. Ike opposed it, so did Bradley. And so they had a big argument about that. What really happened was that Ike did agree that he could try that venture against going through the Remagen Bridge, which failed miserably. It was taken despite the fact that intelligence reports showed that the Germans had a number of panzer divisions there and was bound to fail. But that put Montgomery's big plan, arrow plan, out of existence. But he and Bradley were constantly fighting over who was in command where. It confirmed Eisenhower's belief that the war had to go on a broader front and not just spearhead as Montgomery wanted. And it was slower. Originally, everybody thought that we were going to be out of there by Christmas 1944. And as you know, we weren't out there till the spring of 1945. Patton was, of course, a security risk. As you probably know, he was brought back from Sicily and is supposed to be sent back to America, but it was decided that would help our cover plan if the Germans thought that he was in command of the army that was to invade Pas-de-Calais. So Patton really didn't get into the war until sometime after D-Day. But he was a great tactical commander, although he couldn't keep his mouth shut. And while he was still brought back and on probation, he made a speech to school in which he said, well, as soon as we, not in these words, but the effect was, as soon as we Brits and Americans beat the Germans, we have Russia to take care of, because they were our allies at the time, and that was a big fuss. And Ike did tell him, sent under assistants to first to tell him to be careful, and then said, but what did he really say? And the assistant said, well, he really said, keep your goddamn mouth shut, or I'm going to kick you out of here. Patton had done so many things that Bradley disapproved of that he didn't even want Patton there. He wanted him sent back home. But Patton, when the war did launch his third armory, why it was so successful that I think that he Bradley repented and was happy to have them. They worked together closely after that. Patton always wanted more. He was given as much as he could, but there were problems which, for instance, John Courthouse Lee, General Lee, was in charge of supplies. And it's well known that when he used more than most anyone else, had his own private plane, he had first person to get in his supplies with he and his staff and not the people on the front lines. When we went into Paris, Ike was standing at the Arc de Triomphe when along comes Courthouse Lee's thousands of men to take over all the buildings which had been occupied by the Germans. And Patton was screaming for more fuel, and I got mad, and he wanted to get rid of Lee. And he found that Lee had too many friends back in Washington to relieve him the overall command that he had, but he did manage to get him out of the European theater and brought in someone else who would not use as much supplies. But there were things like that as far as supplies are concerned. Who gets them, who needs them. And Patton always felt that if he had had more gasoline, he could have crossed the Rhine and gone on all the way into Berlin. When the Germans finally surrendered, first they tried to surrender to Montgomery, and Eisenhower said, well, I won't quote him exactly because Ike was a little inclined toward profanity, as most of the West Pointers were. But no, they're going to surrender to him and going to surrender completely. And they did surrender, of course, first at Rans, but the Russians refused to recognize that, although they had one of their generals there who signed the treaty. He was never heard from after that. The Russians insisted that we come to Berlin to sign a peace treaty, so we did the very next day. Ike, of course, did not participate in the signing. It was signed in his headquarters, first of all, at Rand's, in the little schoolhouse, which we'd taken over the headquarters, advanced headquarters of SHAEF. He sat in his office until this was finally worked out, which was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And then the Germans came into his office, and they stood at attention, and well, he dressed them down, and that was the end of that. But when we had to do it at Berlin, he sent Beadle Smith and his other commanders to Berlin to sign it. I don't think that he ever felt that he'd be needed in the war against Japan, because our commander in Japan let it be known who was boss over there, and Ike had been his assistant at one time in the Philippines.
Of course, we're talking about MacArthur. Yep.
Yeah, and we certainly are. Now, MacArthur thought he was going to be president. He was going to, but no, and MacArthur was not at all polite where Ike was concerned when he thought Ike was doing something in Europe that he didn't agree with. He sent some rather nasty messages. I'm not so sure there's conflict as much as it was that McCarthy felt that he was still the top dog. Oh, I went from private to colonel, and after the war, the Air Force decided they'd make me a major general, which I thought was bad because I told the commanding general that if I accepted, I'd have to salute him instead of the other way around. By that time, I had created the Civilian Military Institute, and I was chairman of it. And I had arrangements to come back to America as soon as peace was signed because I had to was in charge of arguing the veterans' reemployment cases up to and through the Supreme Court of the United States. So I saw him right after that, and for some reason President Truman decided to pin a medal on me, and Ike was there in his office.
What medal was that?
Oh, Lord. Not one that as high as the one that I would have gotten had I won the case before the Supreme Court.
What was the issue in that case?
Veterans reemployment. But what happened, of course, was the unions were against it, since their people had been promoted, and now they didn't want the veterans coming home to take over their jobs. And the Supreme Court, I won in the Court of Appeals, but the Supreme Court decided it's best not to do it. And it didn't come as a surprise to us. Well, I was anxious to get out of uniform and get back into the practice of law, but there were many families in France that I'd come to know that wanted me to handle their legal affairs. And the same thing was true in London. And so I opened a London office with the leading law firm in London, and because the senior partner there had been a close friend of mine. So that during the first several years after the war, I was constantly in France and England working on legal problems with people that I'd met in England during the war and in France during the war. So yes, it did affect my civil life in that manner. But I did not join the reserve as I was asked to.
Did you ever think at that time he might become the president of the country?
Absolutely not. He sent out a message to his officers toward the end of the war, saying that he was being asked by both parties to run for president. He had absolutely refused because he did not have the broad enough background, that no general had the broad enough background to be president, and so he would not do it. Later on, when he changed his mind, I was asked if I would be head of the Veterans for Eisenhower Committee for president, and I declined because I agreed with him. I didn't mean to imply a moment ago that it was a bad thing that Eisenhower was elected president, because we needed a hands-off president during those periods. The economy was growing so rapidly. Ike, of course, set a record for a number of golf games played during that time. And of course, he was here in Denver for about 2 years when he had his heart attack. But it was a time when the economy was really growing, and we didn't need much action from the president.
Did you keep in contact with him after the war?
No. I wish I had, but I didn't see him but rarely. I did see him from time to time, of course, and our paths did cross.